In the early years of the Cold War, fear did not come only from bombs or armies. It came from the idea that the human mind itself could be turned into a weapon. Intelligence officials believed that enemies were learning how to erase identity, extract confessions, and control behavior without force. In response, a secret program was approved inside the United States government. Its purpose was simple to define, but dangerous to pursue: to understand how far the mind could be pushed, altered, or broken. What followed unfolded quietly across hospitals, universities, and ordinary rooms that looked harmless from the outside. For decades, the program remained hidden. When fragments of the truth finally emerged, they raised a question that still has no easy answer. What happens when national security is allowed to override human consent? To understand why the CIA created MKUltra, it helps to return to the early years of the Cold War, a time defined not by open battles, but by fear and uncertainty. World War II had ended, yet peace felt unstable. Former allies had become ideological rivals, and intelligence agencies began to worry about threats that could not be seen or measured. The focus slowly shifted away from weapons and toward psychology, belief, and influence. During the Korean War, reports emerged that deeply unsettled American officials. Some prisoners of war returned, having signed confessions. Others publicly criticized the United States. A few appeared emotionally distant or ideologically changed. These cases were described using a new and alarming word: brainwashing. Whether the phenomenon was real or exaggerated mattered less than the reaction it provoked. Intelligence leaders feared that enemy nations might be learning how to manipulate the human mind. If thoughts and loyalty could be altered without physical force, traditional defenses would become meaningless. At the same time, psychology was evolving rapidly. Researchers were exploring conditioning, perception, memory, and the unconscious. New substances that altered cognition were being studied, often without a clear understanding of their risks. To intelligence officials, this uncertainty looked like opportunity. If the mind could be influenced, it could also be examined, tested, and potentially controlled. The logic was straightforward. The United States could not afford to assume such methods would fail. If adversaries were experimenting, America needed to do the same. In 1953, under this pressure, the CIA approved a secret research program that would later become known as MKUltra. The program did not begin with a detailed plan. It emerged quietly, shaped by internal discussions and a sense of urgency that discouraged restraint. Its mandate was intentionally broad. MKUltra would explore any technique that might affect human behavior, perception, or memory. Oversight was minimal, and secrecy was treated as protection. Information was tightly compartmentalized, even within the agency itself. No single individual was meant to see the full scope of the program. Decisions were made incrementally, each one framed as temporary or experimental. Ethical questions, when raised, were overshadowed by national security concerns. At this early stage, MKUltra was still largely theoretical. Its most controversial actions had not yet taken place, but the foundation had been laid. Fear had narrowed the range of acceptable debate. Secrecy had replaced accountability, and a program designed to explore the limits of the human mind had been allowed to move forward without clearly defining its own limits. Once MKUltra was approved, it quickly became clear that the program would not operate like a conventional research project. There were no clear boundaries, no fixed methodology, and no external oversight. Instead, MKUltra functioned as a framework that allowed almost any line of inquiry, as long as it promised insight into influencing human behavior. It was housed within the CIS Technical Services Division, an obscure branch responsible for developing tools and techniques that supported covert operations. From this position, the program remained largely invisible, even to many within the agency itself. This invisibility was intentional. Oversight was seen as a risk rather than a safeguard. Traditional ethical review processes did not apply. The assumption was that secrecy ensured security, and security justified experimentation. Rather than conducting research in one centralized location, MKUltra expanded outward. Funding was distributed across dozens of subprojects, each operating independently. Universities, hospitals, pharmaceutical companies, and private laboratories received grants through front organizations that concealed the CIS involvement. In many cases, researchers believed they were participating in ordinary scientific studies. They were not told how their work fit into a larger intelligence program. This separation served two purposes. It reduced the likelihood of leaks, and it fragmented responsibility. No single researcher could be held accountable for the overall direction of the program. As MKUltra grew, its scope widened dramatically. Experiments were proposed to study hypnosis, sensory deprivation, isolation, sleep deprivation, stress, and chemical manipulation. There was no unified theory guiding the work, only the belief that something useful might emerge. Failures were expected and tolerated. The absence of results did not lead to restraint, but to expansion. If one approach did not work, another would be tried. This trial-and-error mentality pushed the program further from conventional science and closer to improvisation. Internal documents from the period reveal a striking lack of concern for long-term consequences. Short-term effects were often recorded, but lasting psychological harm was rarely addressed. The subjects were treated as variables, not individuals. This mindset was reinforced by the Cold War atmosphere, where urgency eclipsed caution. Intelligence officials believed they were racing against time, against adversaries who might already be ahead. Within this framework, limits were seen as liabilities. The program's leadership encouraged creativity and persistence, but not restraint. What mattered was exploration, not certainty. As a result, MKUltra became less a single project and more a collection of loosely connected experiments, each probing the mind from a different angle. From the outside, the program appeared disorganized. Internally, it was protected by classification and compartmentalization. Questions about ethics were rarely formalized. Concerns, when raised, were absorbed into bureaucracy and dissolved. At this stage, MKUltra still lacked a defining focus. It was a program in search of a breakthrough, driven by fear and sustained by secrecy. The most controversial elements had not yet emerged, but the structure that allowed them was firmly in place. With few limits and little accountability, MKUltra was poised to escalate, moving from observation toward direct intervention in the human mind. As MKUltra expanded, one substance began to dominate the program's attention more than any other: LSD. In the early 1950s, the drug was still poorly understood and legally available. Researchers knew it could dramatically alter perception, mood, and sense of self, but they did not know how or why. To intelligence officials, this unpredictability made LSD especially valuable. If a substance could temporarily disrupt identity and reality, it might also reveal how beliefs could be weakened or replaced. The CDA saw LSD not as a medical tool, but as a potential instrument of influence. Experiments were designed to observe how individuals reacted under its effects, how their thoughts changed, and whether resistance could be reduced. At first, some tests were conducted with volunteers who believed they were participating in legitimate research. These studies often took place in hospitals or academic settings, framed as psychological or pharmaceutical trials. But the scope quickly widened. LSD was administered to military personnel, prisoners, and patients, often without full disclosure. In some cases, subjects were not informed at all. The goal was to observe genuine reactions, unfiltered by expectation. Researchers documented confusion, heightened suggestibility, anxiety, and emotional instability. In certain experiments, subjects lost their sense of time or personal identity. These outcomes were not treated as failures. They were recorded as useful data. Within the logic of MKUltra, distress was evidence that the substance had power. One of the most troubling aspects of these experiments was how casually they were justified. Internal communications framed LSD as a temporary intervention, minimizing concern for long-term effects. Psychological harm was rarely discussed beyond immediate symptoms. The possibility that damage might persist after the drug wore off was largely ignored. As reports accumulated, enthusiasm grew. LSD appeared to open doors that traditional interrogation never could. It disrupted certainty. It blurred memory. It weakened emotional defenses. For intelligence officials searching for leverage over the human mind, this seemed promising. Yet the results were inconsistent. Some subjects became withdrawn. Others became paranoid. A few reacted violently or suffered breakdowns. There was no reliable way to predict outcomes. This unpredictability did not slow the program. It encouraged further testing. The logic was simple. Variability meant there was still more to learn. As LSD became central to MKUltra, the line between experimentation and exploitation grew increasingly thin. Subjects were exposed to powerful psychological stress without safeguards or follow-up. Responsibility was fragmented among researchers, administrators, and funding channels. No single authority paused the process to ask whether the risks outweighed the potential benefits. At this stage, MKUltra had moved beyond theoretical exploration. It was actively intervening in human consciousness, driven by the belief that understanding the mind required breaking it down. What remained unclear was whether the program was discovering new knowledge or simply accumulating evidence of harm. What made MKUltra especially troubling was not only what was being tested, but who was being tested on. As the program continued, the pool of subjects quietly expanded beyond controlled laboratory settings. Patients seeking medical help, prisoners, military personnel, and ordinary citizens all became part of experiments they did not understand and often did not consent to. In some cases, individuals believed they were participating in legitimate medical or psychological research. In others, they were not aware they were part of any experiment at all. The program's designers viewed this ambiguity as useful. Genuine reactions, they believed, could only be observed when subjects did not know they were being studied. This belief justified deception as a scientific necessity. One of the most disturbing practices involved administering psychoactive substances without warning. LSD, in particular, was sometimes given to individuals in hospitals, clinics, and even social settings designed to appear completely ordinary. The goal was to observe how people reacted when their perception of reality was suddenly altered. Researchers documented confusion, anxiety, paranoia, and emotional collapse. These reactions were recorded as data, not as harm. Responsibility for the outcomes was often unclear. Experiments were conducted across multiple locations by different researchers under different institutional labels. If a subject suffered psychological damage, it was difficult to trace where accountability lay. This fragmentation was not accidental. It protected the program by ensuring that no single failure could expose the whole. Some experiments took place in environments deliberately designed to feel safe and familiar. Apartments, offices, and social venues were converted into observation spaces. Subjects believed they were engaging in routine activities. Unbeknownst to them, their behavior was being monitored, analyzed, and manipulated. The contrast between the normal appearance of these spaces and the invasive nature of the experiments was stark. Harm did not announce itself. It arrived quietly, masked by routine. In many cases, subjects were left to deal with the psychological effects on their own. Follow-up care was inconsistent or non-existent. Long-term consequences were rarely tracked. The program's internal logic treated these outcomes as acceptable losses. National security concerns outweighed individual suffering. What mattered was not whether damage occurred, but whether useful information was gained. This approach revealed a deeper shift in moral reasoning. People were no longer seen as participants or patients, but as instruments. Their autonomy was secondary to the goals of the program. Even within this framework, there were moments of unease. Some researchers questioned the ethics of deception and non-consensual testing. Others expressed concern about the unpredictability of the substances being used. These doubts, however, rarely led to meaningful change. The structure of MKUltra absorbed dissent without altering its direction. To object was to risk exclusion or irrelevance. Silence became the safer option. Over time, the program normalized practices that would have been unthinkable under ordinary circumstances. What began as exploratory research evolved into a system that treated human experience as raw material. The most unsettling aspect was not the scale of the experiments, but how easily they blended into everyday life. MKUltra did not rely on overt brutality. Its power came from secrecy, deception, and the quiet assumption that some lives could be used for a greater purpose. By this stage, the program was no longer just studying the mind. It was testing the boundaries of ethical restraint itself. As MKUltra moved deeper into practice, the line between independent scientific research and government authority began to dissolve. The program relied heavily on civilian scientists, doctors, and academics, many of whom never fully understood who was funding their work. Grants were routed through front organizations, allowing the CIA to distance itself from the experiments while still directing their purpose. This arrangement created a dangerous separation. Researchers focused on data and methodology, while the agency focused on potential application. Ethical responsibility fell into the gap between them. Some scientists justified their participation by framing their work as neutral research. Others believed they were contributing to national defense during an extraordinary period. Few questioned how their findings might be used. The CIA encouraged this narrow focus. By keeping researchers compartmentalized, it ensured that no one saw the full picture. Harm, when it occurred, appeared isolated rather than systemic. This structure also protected the program from scrutiny. If an experiment crossed ethical boundaries, accountability was unclear. Was responsibility held by the researcher conducting the study or by the agency funding it in secret? Internally, MKUltra benefited from this ambiguity. Decisions were framed as technical rather than moral. Language mattered. Subjects became assets. Reactions became effects. Psychological distress was reduced to data. This vocabulary created emotional distance and normalized actions that might otherwise have raised concern. Over time, this detachment became institutional. Experiments continued not because they were proven effective, but because stopping them would require acknowledging that they should never have begun. The scientists involved rarely saw themselves as villains. Many believed they were operating within accepted norms, following instructions, and advancing knowledge. Yet the absence of informed consent, the lack of transparency, and the disregard for long-term consequences were not accidents. They were the result of a system designed to prioritize outcomes over individuals. MKUltra did not corrupt science by force. It absorbed it quietly, reshaping its purpose through secrecy and funding. By this stage, the program no longer needed constant direction. It sustained itself through routine. Research proposals were approved. Results were filed. New methods were suggested. The machinery of experimentation continued to turn, largely unquestioned. What emerged was not a single unethical decision, but a pattern of small compromises that accumulated over time. In this environment, extraordinary actions became normal. The collaboration between scientists and the state did not collapse ethics overnight. It eroded them gradually, until the distinction between research and exploitation became difficult to see. As the program searched for something that could reliably alter perception and behavior, attention began to focus on a substance that was still largely misunderstood. Lysergic acid diethylamide, known as LSD, had been synthesized only a few years earlier, and its effects were unpredictable, intense, and difficult to control. To intelligence officials, this unpredictability was not a drawback. It was precisely what made the drug appealing. LSD appeared capable of dissolving familiar mental structures, disrupting memory, and altering a person's sense of self. If the mind could be destabilized so completely, it raised an obvious question. Could it also be reshaped? Early experiments were framed as exploratory. Researchers administered LSD in controlled environments and recorded changes in perception, emotional response, and cognitive function. Subjects reported hallucinations, confusion, anxiety, and profound shifts in awareness. Some described a sense of losing their identity altogether. These reactions were carefully documented, but rarely interpreted as warnings. Instead, they were viewed as evidence that the drug had potential. Over time, LSD moved from the margins of MKUltra to its center. It was cheap, powerful, and easy to administer. More importantly, it did not require physical force. This aligned perfectly with the program's underlying goal: to influence the mind without leaving visible traces. As experiments expanded, consent became increasingly inconsistent. Some subjects volunteered, believing they were participating in medical or psychological research. Others were never informed they had been given the drug at all. In certain cases, LSD was administered in hospitals, prisons, and military settings under vague or misleading pretenses. The boundaries between research and exploitation blurred. Researchers often justified their actions by pointing to the larger mission. National security, they argued, required difficult choices. The effects of LSD were unpredictable not only for subjects, but for those observing them. Some experiments ended abruptly when participants became severely distressed or disoriented. Others continued despite visible psychological harm. Follow-up care was inconsistent, and long-term consequences were rarely tracked. The focus remained on immediate reactions rather than lasting damage. Within the structure of MKUltra, negative outcomes were not seen as failures. They were simply additional data points. This mindset created a dangerous feedback loop. The more extreme the reaction, the more interest it generated. As reports circulated within the program, LSD began to be seen not just as a research tool, but as a potential operational asset. Intelligence officials speculated about its use in interrogations, influence operations, and psychological disruption. The ethical implications of these ideas were rarely addressed directly. The secrecy surrounding MKUltra insulated decision-makers from external criticism and internal doubt. Many researchers involved focused narrowly on their own experiments, detached from how the results might be applied. This fragmentation of responsibility made it easier to ignore the broader picture. What emerged during this phase was a shift in the program's character. MKUltra was no longer just observing the mind. It was actively intervening, probing how far consciousness could be altered before something essential was lost. LSD did not provide clear answers or reliable control. What it revealed instead was the fragility of human perception. And rather than prompting restraint, this discovery encouraged further experimentation. The program had found a tool that opened doors it did not fully understand. Instead of closing them, it chose to keep going. By the early 1970s, MKUltra was no longer completely hidden. The political climate in the United States had changed, and public trust in government institutions was collapsing. The Vietnam War, the Pentagon Papers, and the Watergate scandal had created an atmosphere of suspicion. Against this backdrop, Congress began to examine the activities of intelligence agencies more closely than ever before. In 1974, investigative journalists revealed that the CIA had conducted illegal domestic operations, prompting formal inquiries. What followed were the Church Committee hearings in the Senate and parallel investigations in the House of Representatives. For the first time, intelligence officials were asked to explain programs that had operated in secrecy for decades. MKUltra quickly emerged as one of the most troubling discoveries. Investigators struggled to reconstruct its scope, not because of complexity, but because so much evidence was missing. Years earlier, CIA Director Richard Helms had ordered the destruction of MKUltra records. Thousands of documents were deliberately shredded, leaving only fragments behind. What survived was incomplete, scattered, and often vague. Even so, the remaining files revealed a pattern of experimentation that shocked lawmakers. Witnesses described research involving drugs, psychological manipulation, and non-consensual testing. Some officials defended the program as a product of its time, arguing that Cold War pressures required extraordinary measures. Others remained silent, citing national security. The hearings exposed not only what MKUltra had done, but how it had been allowed to exist. Oversight had failed. Ethical safeguards had been bypassed. Accountability was unclear. Many victims were never identified, let alone compensated. The investigations produced reforms, including new regulations governing human experimentation and intelligence oversight. But the damage could not be undone. Much of what MKUltra involved would never be fully known. The truth that emerged was partial, constrained by destroyed records and fading memories. What became clear, however, was that MKUltra was not an isolated mistake. It was the result of a system that valued secrecy over transparency and results over restraint. When the hearings ended, the program was officially terminated. Yet the questions it raised did not disappear. They lingered in the gaps left behind, in the documents that no longer existed, and in the realization that some truths, once buried, can never be fully recovered. By the time MKUltra officially ended, its full scope was already impossible to reconstruct. In the early 1970s, as public trust in government collapsed under the weight of Vietnam and Watergate, intelligence agencies came under increasing scrutiny. Congressional investigations began to examine past covert programs, including those related to behavioral research. When inquiries turned toward MKUltra, officials inside the CIA reacted quickly. Records were destroyed. Files were shredded. What remained was fragmented, incomplete, and often deliberately vague. Even so, what investigators uncovered was enough to raise serious concern. Testimony revealed years of experimentation conducted without informed consent, often on vulnerable populations. Many subjects never learned they had been part of an intelligence program at all. The official justification was familiar. Actions were framed as products of their time, driven by Cold War pressures and incomplete knowledge. Responsibility was dispersed across departments, contractors, and decades. No single individual could be clearly held accountable. As a result, consequences were limited. A small number of victims received compensation. No major criminal charges followed. The program faded into history without a definitive reckoning. Yet MKUltra's legacy did not disappear. It reshaped how research ethics were understood in the United States. Institutional review boards became standard. Informed consent became non-negotiable. These safeguards were not created in anticipation of abuse, but in response to it. MKUltra also left a deeper, less tangible mark. It demonstrated how easily democratic institutions can justify harm when secrecy and fear dominate decision-making. The program did not rely on a single villain or dramatic turning point. It unfolded through ordinary processes, funding approvals, compartmentalized tasks, and assumptions that national security outweighed individual rights. This gradual normalization is what makes MKUltra difficult to dismiss as an anomaly. Its lessons extend beyond intelligence agencies. They apply wherever authority operates without transparency and where urgency is allowed to override restraint. Today, MKUltra is often remembered as a cautionary tale, but caution alone does not prevent repetition. The documents that survived reveal not madness, but rationalization. Each step was justified in isolation. Each boundary crossed seemed temporary. Looking back, the most unsettling aspect of MKUltra is not how extreme it became, but how quietly it began. A program intended to understand the human mind ultimately exposed the vulnerabilities of the systems that governed it. When the pursuit of security eclipses consent and secrecy replaces accountability, the question is no longer what can be done, but what should never be allowed again.